A million ordinary events pass in and out of our awareness every day. But sometimes things happen that are so significant that they become chapter headings in our life story, dividing our lives into the time before and the time after. Becoming a parent was certainly like that for me, and I'm sure for lots of you. Ordination was another. If my life were a book, those things would not just mark a new chapter, but a whole new volume. Can you bring to mind transitions like that in your own life? Sometimes they are changes that we have planned for and welcomed, like babies, sometimes, and ordinations. Sometimes they are sudden, unexpected, and unwelcome, like an accident or serious illness or bereavement or the end of a relationship. Sometimes things happen to us that divide our lives in two, the before and the after. All 4 Bible readings this morning bring us the perspective of someone reflecting on a transition like that. The Gospel reading brings us to a major turning point in the Gospel of Mark and in the life of the disciples, especially Peter. Peter has just found himself able to articulate his understanding that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. He has been watching Jesus do one extraordinary thing after another, healing people, casting out demons, telling amazing stories, wondering what it all means and where it is all leading. Now he is beginning to know who Jesus is. Everything is going to change for him after this, and not in the way he expects. He has said out loud that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the fulfillment of all his people's hopes for freedom and victory. And Jesus says, yes, you're absolutely right, and I'm going to be rejected and put to death. That is not the path Peter thought he was walking. So he resists. Of course he did, wouldn't you? Then, rather than reassuring him, Jesus says, well, what's more, you're going to suffer with me. I'm carrying a cross as I walk the road toward crucifixion. And if you want to walk with me, then you're on the same road, also carrying a cross. Not what he wanted to hear, I'm sure. But the thing is, for him, for Peter, Jesus has called him to be a partner on this road. And Peter has spent enough time with Jesus by now that he knows he would rather walk the hardest, most difficult road with Jesus than any other road, however easy, without Jesus. And so he chooses to stay. And nothing can ever be the same after that. For the rest of Peter's life, there will always be a BC and an AD. Before the conversation and after the decision to keep following Jesus anyway. And that's a bit like Abraham. He'd already had a big before and after in his life. God had called him to leave his people, his home, everything he knew, and move into an unknown future with nothing but God's promises to guide him. And since then, he had done all the wrong things that people do when they are lost and disoriented. But he hadn't gone back. He had stayed, more or less, on the road God had called him to take. Though years passed and the hope of God actually giving him the promised child grew dimmer and dimmer. Today we read about that the 3rd time that God appeared to him to declare God's commitment to those promises, to God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants. There are 4 of these appearances in Genesis before the promised son is born, 4 declarations of God's promise before there was the slightest, teeniest sign of fulfillment. The account of Abraham we read in Romans this morning is slightly rose-tinted, you might have noticed, when it says that Abraham's faith didn't waver. Yeah, his faith wavered a lot. It seemed so unlikely that he and Sarah would have a child that he tried all sorts of shortcuts, including exploiting a slave to make her provide a child for him. So God appears to him this time to insist that the covenant promises are not just for him, as he seems to have assumed, but for him and Sarah. Sarah was not an optional extra. She was Abraham's partner, and there was no way God was going to allow her to be left out of this great work of making a family that would bless the world, any more than God would let Hagar miss out on also being a matriarch of a great family. So this was a turning point for both Abraham and Sarah. After this, they would both need to be much more conscious that they had been called into partnership with God and with each other. Nothing could be the same after that. In Romans, we read Paul's reflections on God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah, and we are reminded of the great turning point in Paul's life. In his zeal for his Jewish faith, he had thought God wanted him to violently oppose the Jesus movement. He'd been traveling around putting followers of Jesus in prison when Jesus met him on the road to Damascus. And everything changed that day. Not only did he turn around and become a follower of Jesus himself, but he realized that God's promises were actually for everybody, and that it was his job, that God was calling him to announce the good news to the Gentiles, that God's promises made to the Jewish people were actually for all the world. The direction of his life completely changed then, not just because he met Jesus once. It changed everything because Jesus became his constant companion, his partner in the work that Jesus called him to. That is, to open wide the doors of covenant invitation to Gentiles. And with that invitation, everything changed for everyone. Paul explains in the Romans reading that if we, who are mostly Gentiles, I'm assuming most people at St. Paul's are Gentiles, and perhaps most viewers, my apologies if that is an incorrect assumption, but if we want to demonstrate that we are Sarah and Abraham's descendants and co-inheritors of those promises made to them, it's not going to be by obeying the law, because Abraham didn't obey the law. Obeying the law does not connect us to Abraham. Instead, we imitate Abraham and Sarah's faithfulness to the covenant. That is, the way they stayed on the road that God called them on. Theirs wasn't a superhuman faith. So that's not what we need. Teeny tiny faith that was easily frightened and distracted. It was just enough faith to believe God when God showed up, and not to just give up and go home. So we demonstrate that we are their descendants by exercising faith like theirs, not superhuman faith, just enough faith to believe God when God shows up, as God did show up magnificently in Jesus. And so we follow Jesus. We keep walking the path Jesus called us on. We get frightened and distracted like they did. We go off track like they did, but we turn back again and again. God promised Abraham and Sarah that their descendants would bless every family of the earth. So, if we want to demonstrate that we are part of that family of promise, well, if we are their descendants, we need to get on with what their descendants are supposed to do, which is to bless the people around us, to bless the world. But we need to back up a bit and admit that this is a hard thing to talk about in the 21st century. It's hard to speak about Abraham's biological descendants at all because of initially because of the unfathomable evil they were subjected to last century. As a people, they also have had a before and an after. Before Hitler and after. Before Kristallnacht and after. Before the death camps and after. Nothing can be the same for any of us after that. In fact, Christian preaching certainly can't be the same. It is necessarily uncomfortable to speak about Abraham and Sarah's descendants and to claim that we are their descendants too. Well, doesn't that just seem cruel? For us to say when we were not raised by parents and grandparents who'd been through that hell, there is a danger of us implying that God has forgotten the covenant to them, to the original descendants, by now making us partners in the covenant, as though the covenant is now with Christians and not with Jews. And so I want to be absolutely clear, God does not walk away from a covenant. The biological descendants of Sarah and Abraham are still God's covenant partners. It is just that for us, through Jesus, we have been graciously invited in to share their inheritance. It is uncomfortable to speak of these things, and particularly uncomfortable now with all the violence in Gaza. This is such a terribly complex situation that it's hard to say anything helpful. We know, of course, that the Israeli government does not act for or speak for all or even most Jewish people. Many Jewish people are among the loudest voices calling for a ceasefire. If we had the opportunity to say one thing to Netanyahu after reflecting on God's covenant with Sarah and Abraham, what I might say would be this. God promised to bless the world through the descendants of Abraham and Sarah. And in so many ways, God has blessed the world through the Jewish people. But are you, Netanyahu, blessing the world? How could the world possibly be blessed by the deaths of so many people, including so many children in Gaza? And as soon as we imagine asking Netanyahu that question, we need to turn it back on ourselves. We also claim to be descendants of Abraham and Sarah, so what are we doing to bless the world? We need to ask that question with every decision we make. Will this thing we're about to do bring blessing? Will it bring peace, healing, and joy to the world, or won't it? God has called us to be partners with God in bringing blessing to the world. This is a high calling, a difficult calling, but also a joyful calling. As Emily Dickinson wrote, if I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one life the aching, or cool one pain, or help one fainting robin into its nest again, I shall not live in vain. This is what we were created for. This is the life we are called to. And when we focus on blessing others, we feel most fully alive, most fully ourselves, which must be at least part of what Jesus meant when he said that giving away our life, ourselves, is the way to save it. Life is not about comfort or acquisition or victory. It is about relationship, partnership, for the blessing of the world. Peter and Paul were called by Jesus to lives of great struggle and suffering. That was not the life either of them had chosen, but once they met Jesus, they could not live their lives without him. And Jesus made sure they never had to. He was their constant companion. By the Holy Spirit and in the community of faith, Jesus continues to be our constant companion. Abraham was called by God to leave everything that was secure and familiar and live for decades on a hope that seemed utterly ridiculous. On that road, he took a long time to learn the value of his traveling companion, to learn that Sarah, his wife, was not an optional extra, a little add-on to the Abraham story, but an equal partner with him in living into God's promises. Likewise, we need to be reminded that our fellow Christians are not optional extras in the life of faith. The life of blessing we are called to is fundamentally a shared life. And that's a good thing, because blessing the world is as an isolated individual is much less fun. It is only as partners with God and with each other that we can live into our inheritance and claim our birthright to bless the world, as we together turn a new page and begin a new volume in the story of hope. Amen.